He left his home believing it would still be there when he returned. One quiet year away. No drama. No warnings. Just time. But when he finally came back, what stood on his land didn't look like a mistake. It looked permanent. A full clubhouse. A swimming pool. Lights, fences, laughter. All built where his house once stood, as if his ownership had simply expired. The HOA claimed it was progress. The neighbors treated it like a community win. And suddenly, one man was standing alone against a system that acted as if his property had never been his at all. No notice that mattered. No apology that counted. Just paperwork, power, and silence. The question wasn't how this happened. The question was simple. What do you do when the people meant to protect the neighborhood decide you're expendable? Before any of it went wrong, his life in the neighborhood was almost invisible in the best possible way. He was the kind of homeowner HOAs loved to point to as proof that their system worked. Quiet, consistent, reliable. His house sat on a generous corner lot near the edge of the community, bordered by mature trees and a stretch of open land that had always made his property feel slightly separate from the rest. He paid his dues on time, followed the rules without obsession, and rarely attended meetings because there was never a reason to. Nothing ever happened to him. And in HOA communities, that felt like success. The neighborhood itself was marketed as orderly and upscale, built around the promise of shared amenities and carefully enforced standards. The HOA board took pride in keeping everything uniform, polished, and compliant. Lawns matched. Paint colors blended. Driveways stayed clear. On paper, it was the kind of place where conflict was handled quietly and authority was rarely questioned. Residents trusted that the rules existed to protect them, not to surprise them. The homeowner had lived there long enough to feel secure. His property lines were clear. His paperwork was in order. The land had been surveyed years earlier when he bought the house, and nothing had ever been disputed. That sense of certainty mattered, because when life pulled him away from the neighborhood, he left with the assumption that things would remain exactly as he left them. 1 year. That was all. A temporary move for personal reasons that didn't feel dangerous or dramatic. He notified the HOA, kept paying his dues, and made arrangements for basic maintenance. In his mind, that was more than enough. While he was gone, the neighborhood kept evolving. The HOA board changed members. Committees formed and dissolved. Long-standing plans that had once stalled began moving again. There had always been talk of expanding amenities, improving shared spaces, and increasing property values through visible upgrades. For years, those ideas never went anywhere. Too expensive. Too complicated. Too much resistance. But absence has a way of creating opportunity, especially when oversight feels distant. From the outside, nothing about the homeowner's lot looked vulnerable. But internally, the HOA had begun to see it differently. It was large. It was quiet. And most importantly, the owner wasn't there to notice small changes, temporary markers, or early-stage activity. What started as administrative discussions slowly shifted into planning sessions. What had once been hypothetical became practical. And what should have triggered legal caution instead became a problem to work around. Back home, the homeowner believed his return would be simple. Walk back into a familiar space. Unlock a door that still belonged to him. Resume life where he had paused it. He had no reason to think otherwise. No warning letters that raised alarms. No urgent notices demanding immediate action. Everything about his absence had felt officially acknowledged and harmless. What he didn't know was that decisions were being made in rooms he wasn't in, based on interpretations he hadn't approved, by people who had grown comfortable speaking on his behalf. The HOA had convinced itself that it understood the land better than the man who owned it. And the neighbors, trusting the authority they'd always trusted, assumed everything happening had already been handled correctly. By the time his return date approached, the neighborhood had already adjusted to a new reality. A future they believed was settled. A structure they believed belonged to everyone. And a piece of land they no longer associated with a single homeowner at all. The first sign that something was wrong came before he ever reached his street. The roads felt busier than he remembered, lined with unfamiliar cars and temporary signage that suggested ongoing improvements. It looked like progress, the kind of growth HOAs love to advertise. At first, he felt a strange sense of pride, assuming the community had simply invested in itself while he was gone. That assumption lasted until he turned the final corner and realized the open space beside his home was no longer open at all. What stood there was not a half-finished project or a temporary structure. It was complete, landscaped, operational. A clubhouse with a wide patio, tall fencing, and a pool that reflected the afternoon sun like it had always belonged there. Pathways cut through what had once been his yard. Lighting fixtures stood exactly where his property markers had been. There was no ambiguity, no confusion. This wasn't an error waiting to be corrected. This was a decision that had already been normalized. The shock didn't fade. It hardened. He searched for signs that this was somehow reversible, that permits or markers would reveal a misunderstanding. Instead, everything pointed in the opposite direction. HOA signage framed the entrance. Maintenance schedules were posted. Access points were clearly defined, none of them acknowledging that the land beneath them belonged to someone else. It was as if his ownership had been quietly erased while he was away. Within days, the administrative pressure began. Letters arrived filled with language that felt rehearsed and carefully sanitized. References to community benefit. Mentions of approval processes. Claims that the development complied with internal rules. None of it explained how private property had become communal space. When he pushed back through official channels, the responses grew slower and more procedural. Each interaction pushed him further into a maze of forms, committees, and appeals that never directly addressed the core issue. Then came the fines. They weren't for the clubhouse or the pool. They were for violations tied to his original home. Allegations of non-compliance. Claims of neglected maintenance. Notices that implied his property had fallen below HOA standards during his absence. Each fine carried a deadline. Each deadline came with penalties for delay. It felt intentional, as if the HOA was building a financial case to weaken his position while framing him as irresponsible. What made it worse was the timing. The fines escalated just as construction activity intensified. Contractors appeared regularly. Trucks moved in and out. The clubhouse amenities expanded, adding features that made the structure feel even more permanent. Every improvement made it harder to imagine the HOA ever backing down. Every day that passed strengthened their claim through sheer momentum. Neighbors began treating the space as if it had always been shared. Families gathered. Events were scheduled. The pool became a focal point of the community. No one questioned its placement anymore. The land had been absorbed into collective memory, rewritten as common ground. And standing against that narrative made the homeowner look like an obstacle rather than a victim. Behind the scenes, the HOA leaned into technicalities. They cited outdated surveys. They referenced obscure clauses buried deep in community bylaws. They suggested that previous board approvals, combined with his extended absence, had created a gray area that justified their actions. The language was deliberately vague, crafted to confuse rather than clarify. Every response avoided acknowledging outright wrongdoing while insisting everything had been handled correctly. As weeks passed, the pressure intensified. More fines arrived. Notices warned of liens. Administrative fees were added for delayed responses, even when responses had already been sent. The system moved quickly when it benefited the HOA and painfully slowly when it didn't. Each attempt to regain control felt like stepping into deeper water with no visible shore. The emotional toll became unavoidable. Returning home no longer felt like relief. It felt like intrusion. The place he once owned was now treated as a backdrop to something larger, something he was expected to accept quietly. His frustration turned into determination, but determination came with consequences. Every formal challenge triggered another wave of resistance. Every request for documentation was met with partial disclosures and redirected accountability. The HOA board, emboldened by community support, framed the situation as settled. Internal communications suggested the matter was closed. The project had been completed. The amenities were operational. Reversing it would harm property values. That narrative wasn't just defensive. It was aggressive. It positioned any opposition as selfish and disruptive. What the homeowner began to realize was that this wasn't just about land. It was about power. The HOA had tested its authority and found little resistance. His absence had created a window, and they had used it fully. Now, undoing their actions meant challenging not just a board, but an entire system designed to protect itself. Legal gray areas became weapons. The HOA relied on interpretations that favored permanence over correction. They argued that dismantling the structure would cause undue hardship. They hinted that compensation, not restoration, might be the only reasonable outcome. But even that suggestion came without acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was framed as generosity, not accountability. As the months dragged on, the situation grew more public. Whispered conversations turned into open speculation. Some neighbors sympathized quietly but refused to speak up. Others fully embraced the HOA's version of events. The divide deepened, isolating the homeowner further. The community he once blended into now felt like an audience watching a conflict they believed had already been decided. And still, the HOA pressed forward. Additional amenities were approved. More improvements were scheduled. Each new addition raised the stakes, increasing the cost and complexity of any potential reversal. It was a calculated move, one designed to create a point of no return. What no one could see yet was how fragile that confidence really was. Beneath the polished exterior of compliance and community benefit, cracks were forming. Documents didn't align perfectly. Timelines raised questions. Approvals didn't always match authority. The deeper the homeowner dug, the more inconsistencies surfaced. But uncovering them would require pushing harder than the HOA expected. It would mean risking everything they were trying to take from him. And as the pressure reached its peak, one realization became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a deliberate gamble. And the next move would decide who truly owned the ground beneath that pool. The turning point didn't arrive quietly. It came with weight, timing, and consequences the HOA never anticipated. For months, they had relied on confidence, repetition, and the assumption that complexity would protect them. They believed the longer the clubhouse stood, the more unquestionable it became. They believed momentum was on their side. And most of all, they believed the homeowner would eventually accept a settlement, walk away, or simply run out of strength. Instead, he did the one thing they hadn't prepared for. He stopped reacting and started documenting. Every notice, every fine, every delay was traced back to its source. Timelines were reconstructed. Decisions were mapped against authority. What emerged wasn't just a dispute over land. It was a pattern. Approvals signed by people who didn't yet hold office. Votes recorded without quorum. Emergency provisions invoked for a project planned years in advance. The HOA's confidence had masked something far more dangerous than arrogance. It had masked carelessness. The real shock came when the original land survey resurfaced, paired with a more recent, independent assessment. The boundaries were not vague. They were exact. The clubhouse wasn't near his property. It was centered on it. The pool sat directly over land registered solely in his name. Not leased. Not easement. Not conditionally transferred. The HOA's argument collapsed under that clarity, but they didn't admit it. Instead, they doubled down. They claimed implied consent. They leaned harder on bylaws. They insisted that community benefit outweighed individual inconvenience. The language became colder, more forceful. Threats of escalating legal costs appeared. The message was clear. They intended to win by exhaustion if not by legitimacy. Then came the meeting. It was supposed to be routine. A scheduled HOA assembly meant to finalize budget approvals and discuss upcoming projects. Attendance was high. Residents filled the room expecting updates, not conflict. The board sat elevated, composed, practiced. They had no idea what was coming. When the homeowner took the floor, there was no anger in his posture. No raised voice. No emotional appeal. Just facts, delivered in order, without interruption. He didn't accuse. He demonstrated. He laid out timelines that contradicted official records. He referenced approvals that predated board appointments. He pointed out discrepancies between filed permits and construction dates. One by one, the justifications the HOA had relied on unraveled in front of the very community that had trusted them. The room shifted. Whispers replaced silence. Board members avoided eye contact. What had been framed as a settled matter suddenly felt unfinished. The homeowner didn't stop. He revealed correspondence that showed intentional delay. Notices sent late. Responses withheld. Fees added despite compliance. Each example chipped away at the image of responsible governance the HOA had built so carefully. And then came the final blow. He presented the document no one expected, a formal notice filed before the clubhouse ever opened. A recorded objection. A refusal of consent. Submitted, acknowledged, and quietly ignored. The HOA hadn't just misunderstood his absence. They had overridden it. Intentionally. That was the moment control slipped. The board tried to regain authority, citing procedure, but procedure no longer mattered. The audience wasn't listening to explanations anymore. They were processing betrayal. The same system they had trusted to protect property values had exposed itself as something else entirely. Not a shield, but a machine willing to sacrifice an individual for convenience. The HOA's legal posture crumbled under scrutiny. Their threats lost weight. Their certainty evaporated. And when the question was finally asked, what authority allowed them to take private land without consent, there was no answer. The fallout was immediate. Emergency consultations. Closed-door meetings. Attempts to reframe the issue as negotiable. But the damage was done. The story had escaped their control. What had once been whispered was now public record. In the days that followed, the tone changed completely. Where there had been fines, there were pauses. Where there had been confidence, there was caution. The HOA stopped expanding the amenities. Contractors were pulled. Maintenance schedules were quietly revised. The board no longer spoke as if the outcome was predetermined. For the homeowner, the moment was surreal. The same people who had dismissed him for months were now careful with their words. Requests replaced demands. Offers replaced ultimatums. The power dynamic had flipped, not because of emotion, but because of exposure. Yet the true climax wasn't the humiliation of the HOA board. It was the realization that the system they controlled had limits. That authority without legitimacy collapses when examined closely enough. The homeowner hadn't just challenged a decision. He had challenged the assumption that absence equals consent. As negotiations loomed and consequences became unavoidable, one truth hung over everything like a shadow the HOA could no longer ignore. The ground beneath that clubhouse had never stopped belonging to him. And now, the cost of pretending otherwise was about to come due. The resolution didn't arrive with celebration or sudden victory. It arrived slowly, the way accountability often does, after the noise fades and consequences become unavoidable. Once the HOA's position collapsed under scrutiny, the urgency shifted from control to containment. What had once been framed as an untouchable community asset was suddenly treated like a liability no one wanted to publicly own. Behind closed doors, the board scrambled. Legal counsel was consulted. Risk assessments were rewritten. The same bylaws once used as weapons were now reinterpreted with caution. The question was no longer whether the homeowner had a claim. It was how much damage the HOA could limit before the situation spiraled further out of their control. The first visible change came quietly. Construction activity stopped entirely. The clubhouse lights were turned off during weekdays. Events were postponed without explanation. Maintenance crews reduced their presence, and signage promoting the amenities was gradually removed. Nothing was announced, but everyone noticed. The neighborhood that had embraced the space so eagerly began to sense that something was wrong. Then came the formal acknowledgement. Without admitting fault outright, the HOA issued a notice stating that the land use was under review due to administrative discrepancies. It was careful language designed to save face, but the meaning was clear. The project had not been as airtight as they claimed. For the first time since the homeowner's return, the HOA publicly recognized that his ownership mattered. Negotiations followed, but they were no longer one-sided. The homeowner was no longer reacting to threats or deadlines. He dictated terms. Every conversation was grounded in documentation, boundaries, and a refusal to accept vague promises. The HOA proposed compensation. He rejected it. They suggested easements. He declined. They floated long-term leases. He refused again. What he wanted wasn't money. It was recognition and restoration. The turning point came when the HOA's insurers became involved. The risk exposure was too high. The precedent too dangerous. If the HOA could lose a case this clear, the ripple effects would reach far beyond one neighborhood. At that moment, the balance tipped completely. The HOA was no longer defending a project. It was protecting itself from collapse. The decision was made swiftly after that. The HOA agreed to remove the clubhouse and pool entirely. Not relocate. Not modify. Remove. The announcement stunned the community. Residents who had once defended the project now struggled to process its disappearance. Some felt betrayed. Others felt relieved. A few felt embarrassed. The structure that had been framed as a symbol of progress was now evidence of overreach. The dismantling process was slow and deliberate. Fences came down first. Then equipment. Then the pool itself. Each step peeled back the illusion of permanence the HOA had relied on for so long. What had once felt immovable was reduced to logistics and timelines. Throughout it all, the homeowner remained steady. There was no victory lap. No public statement. He watched as his land was returned piece by piece, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet sense of closure. The property lines were re-established. The surveys were reaffirmed. The ground was his again, not just legally, but visibly. The consequences for the HOA were unavoidable. Several board members resigned within months. Internal elections were called early. Policies were rewritten to include clearer consent requirements and stricter oversight for land use decisions. What had been treated as flexible authority was now codified with limits. The HOA's legal budget ballooned. Insurance premiums increased. Trust eroded. The neighborhood changed as well. Residents who had once assumed the HOA always acted in their best interest began asking questions. Attendance at meetings increased. Votes were scrutinized. Decisions were challenged. The illusion of infallibility was gone, replaced by a more cautious, more engaged community. The HOA still existed, but it no longer operated unchecked. For the homeowner, life didn't return to what it had been before. It moved forward differently. He rebuilt slowly, intentionally. The land that had been taken from him now carried weight beyond property value. It represented the cost of silence and the danger of assuming systems will protect you without accountability. His sense of belonging in the neighborhood had changed, but so had his sense of agency. What lingered most wasn't anger. It was clarity. The HOA hadn't acted because he was careless or absent. They acted because they believed they could. They believed authority would shield them. They believed complexity would discourage resistance. And for a time, they were right. But authority only works when no one questions it. The impact of the dispute extended beyond one homeowner and one HOA. It exposed a truth many people prefer to ignore. Systems built for order can become tools of convenience when left unchallenged. Rules designed to protect can be twisted to control. And communities that value harmony can sometimes enable harm simply by staying silent. The homeowner didn't win because he was louder. He won because he was precise. He didn't rely on emotion. He relied on record, on boundaries, on the simple fact that ownership doesn't expire just because it's inconvenient. In the end, the land was returned, but the lesson remained. HOAs are powerful because people assume they are reasonable. That assumption is their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. When no one watches closely, when absence is mistaken for consent, when silence is interpreted as surrender, lines can be crossed without resistance. The story didn't end with applause or closure that felt cinematic. It ended with something quieter and more important, a reminder. If a system can take something from you while you're gone, the question isn't whether it should be trusted. The question is whether anyone is paying attention when it decides you no longer matter.